The lights flickered in the lower levels of Nexus Station, casting long shadows across the narrow corridors where only criminals and desperate souls dared to walk. This was the place where fortunes changed hands and lives ended with nothing more than a whispered name and a transfer of credits. Vex Talori sat behind his desk in a room that smelled of recycled air and old secrets, his gray scales catching the dim light as he reviewed the datapad in his four-fingered hands. He had been the senior coordinator for the Crimson Ledger for over 30 cycles, and in all that time he had never once hesitated to accept a contract. Until now. The door slid open with a hiss, and a tall figure entered the room. Dreth Mazon was a Corvani merchant lord, his purple robes trimmed with gold thread that probably cost more than most beings earned in a lifetime. And his 3 eyes gleamed with barely contained fury as he approached the desk. "I have been waiting for 6 standard hours," Mazon said, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who was not accustomed to being ignored. "I was told the Crimson Ledger was the most efficient organization in the business, yet here I stand, still waiting for an answer to a simple request." Vex set down the datapad and gestured for Mazon to take a seat. The merchant lord remained standing, which told Vex everything he needed to know about how this conversation would go. "Your request is not simple," Vex replied, keeping his voice calm and measured. "You have asked us to eliminate a human diplomat named Jake Sullivan, who has been interfering with your mining operations in the Kellar sector." "And what is complicated about that?" Mazon demanded. "I am offering 500,000 credits for a single target, which is more than generous for someone of his status. He is not a military commander or a political leader, just a mid-level diplomat who has been causing problems for my business." Vex leaned back in his chair and studied the merchant lord carefully. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, usually from beings who had grown wealthy without ever truly understanding how the galaxy worked. "I have consulted with every operative in our organization," Vex said slowly. "I have contacted freelancers we have worked with in the past, and I've even reached out to members of rival guilds who owe us favors. The answer is the same from everyone." "And what answer is that?" "No." Mazon's 3 eyes blinked in confusion, as if the word itself was foreign to him. "No? What do you mean, no? I'm offering a fortune for a simple job." "The job is not simple," Vex repeated. "The target is human, and that changes everything." The merchant lord let out a harsh laugh that echoed off the metal walls. "Human? You are telling me that the most feared assassination guild in 4 sectors is afraid of humans? They are newcomers to the galactic stage, barely 200 years since they discovered faster-than-light travel. They are soft, emotional creatures who waste their time on art and philosophy instead of building proper empires." Vex remained silent, allowing Mazon to finish his outburst. He had heard similar arguments before, always from beings who had never actually dealt with humans in any meaningful way. "I will double the payment," Mazon said, leaning forward with his hands on the desk. 1 million credits for 1 diplomat. Surely someone in your organization needs that kind of money. "I have already offered your contract to Scar Ven," Vex replied. The name caused Mazon to pause. Even someone as isolated as a merchant lord had heard of Scar Ven, the assassin who had single-handedly killed an entire planetary council in a single night, the operative who had never failed to complete a contract in over 40 years of service. And he refused? "He did not even let me finish explaining the job," Vex said. "The moment I mentioned that the target was human, he stood up and walked out of the room without saying a word. I have never seen him react that way to anything." Mazon straightened and began pacing the small office, his robes swishing against the floor as he moved. "This is absurd. There must be someone who will take this contract. What about the Void Dancers or the Silent Hand? Surely there are other organizations willing to do what you will not." "I contacted them as a courtesy," Vex admitted. "They gave the same answer. No one will touch a human target, not for any price." Why? Maison stopped pacing and turned to face Vex directly. What is it about these creatures that inspires such fear? They are not physically imposing. They have no natural weapons, no armor, no venomous glands. By every measure they should be easy targets. Vex reached into his desk and pulled out a small data crystal, holding it up so the light caught its surface. This contains the history of every organization that has ever attempted to harm humans. Guild records, intelligence reports, survivor testimonies, all of it points to the same conclusion. Which is what? Attacking humans is a death sentence, Vex said, and for the first time his voice carried a hint of something that might have been fear. Not a risk, not a gamble, but a certainty. Every guild that has ever targeted humans has been completely and utterly destroyed. Maison scoffed and waved his hand dismissively. Propaganda. The humans are clever with their information networks, spreading stories to make themselves seem more dangerous than they really are. Sit down, Vex said, and there was an authority in his voice that made even a merchant lord obey. I am going to tell you a story, and when I am finished, you will understand why the Crimson Ledger will never accept your contract. Maison lowered himself into the chair across from Vex, his expression a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. He clearly believed he was about to hear nothing more than exaggerated tales designed to justify cowardice. Vex activated the data crystal and began to speak. 60 years ago there was a guild called the Shadow Covenant. They were the largest and most powerful assassination organization in known space, with over 3,000 operatives spread across 100 systems. Their leadership believed they were untouchable, and when the Zethrani Empire offered them a contract to destabilize human expansion by eliminating colonial leaders, they accepted without hesitation. I have heard of the Shadow Covenant, Maison said. They vanished decades ago. Some say they disbanded, others say they were absorbed by rival organizations. They did not disband, Vex replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They were exterminated, every single member, hunted down and killed by the very species they had been hired to destroy. And that is only the beginning of what I need to tell you. The lights flickered again, and in the shadows of that cramped office on Nexus Station, Vex Talori began to explain why the most dangerous predators in the galaxy were not the ones with claws and fangs, but the soft-skinned creatures from the small blue planet who had somehow learned to turn persistence into a weapon more terrifying than any the universe had ever seen. Vex led Maison through a series of narrow corridors until they reached a secure archive room deep within the station. The walls were lined with data storage units, each one containing information that governments and corporations would pay fortunes to possess, and the air hummed with the sound of cooling systems working to keep the delicate equipment functioning. What is this place? Maison asked, looking around with a mixture of curiosity and impatience. This is where we keep the records that matter, Vex replied, activating a holographic display in the center of the room. The contracts that went wrong, the operations that failed, the lessons that cost lives to learn, and most importantly, the files on species that should never be targeted under any circumstances. The display flickered to life, showing images of a planet covered in vast mountain ranges and endless forests. Text scrolled alongside the images, detailing population numbers and colonial infrastructure. This is New Montana, Vex explained. 60 years ago it was a young human colony, home to approximately 200,000 settlers, most of them farmers and miners, trying to build new lives on the frontier. The Zethrani Empire saw it as a perfect target, a soft colony far from human military protection. I remember the Zethrani, Maison said. They were a powerful empire in the western sectors. They collapsed about 50 years ago, did they not? They did not collapse, Vex corrected him. They were broken, and what happened on New Montana was the beginning of their end. The Shadow Covenant sent 40 of their finest operatives to the colony, assassins who had completed hundreds of contracts, across dozens of worlds. Their mission was simple: eliminate the colonial leadership and create chaos that would slow human expansion. The holographic display shifted to show personnel files, images of various alien species with lists of their confirmed kills and special abilities. These were beings who had made careers out of ending lives, professionals who understood death in ways that most creatures could never imagine. "What happened to them?" Maison asked, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "None of them returned," Vex said simply. "Not one." Within the first week, 12 operatives went silent. The Shadow Covenant assumed they had been captured, so they sent extraction teams. Those teams also disappeared. The display changed again, this time showing grainy footage from what appeared to be a body camera. The image was dark, showing dense forest and rocky terrain. And somewhere in the background, there was the sound of something moving through the underbrush. This footage was recovered from a data chip found on one of the bodies, Vex explained. It shows the final hours of an operative named Threll, a Venari assassin who specialized in wilderness elimination. He was hunting a human target, a retired Marine named Danny Ortega, who had been organizing the colonial defense. The footage continued, showing the operative moving carefully through the forest, his thermal sensors scanning for heat signatures. Suddenly, the image jerked, and there was a sharp crack, followed by screaming. The camera tumbled and came to rest, showing only dirt and leaves. "A trap," Vex said. "A simple pit covered with branches, lined with sharpened wooden stakes at the bottom. Technology worth thousands of credits, defeated by a hole in the ground." Maison shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but said nothing. Danny Ortega was 63 years old when the Shadow Covenant came to New Montana, Vex continued. He had no cybernetic enhancements, no military-grade equipment, just the skills he had learned during 30 years of service and a knowledge of the land that the assassins could not match. He tracked 3 operatives through those mountains for 19 days without stopping to rest for more than a few hours at a time. 19 days, Maison interrupted. "That is impossible. No being can maintain a pursuit for that long." "Humans can," Vex replied. "Their ancestors evolved as pursuit predators on their homeworld. They would chase prey across vast distances, following tracks and signs, until their targets collapsed from exhaustion. It is called persistence hunting, and it made them the dominant species on their planet, long before they developed advanced tools." The display showed more footage and images, documenting the systematic destruction of the Shadow Covenant operatives. There were recordings of ambushes and traps, evidence of coordinated attacks by colonists who had no formal military training, but who had adapted to the threat with terrifying speed. "The colonists learned," Vex said. "Within a month, they had studied every captured piece of equipment, analyzed every tactic the assassins had used, and developed countermeasures. They shared information across the entire colony, building a network that could track any intruder within hours of their arrival." "But surely the Shadow Covenant had the resources to overwhelm them," Maison protested. 3,000 operatives against a colony of farmers? "They tried," Vex acknowledged. "They sent a second wave, 200 of their best. The colonists were ready. They had turned the entire northern continent into a killing ground, using the terrain and the weather to their advantage. The assassins were not hunting anymore. They were being hunted." The holographic display showed a map with dozens of markers, each one representing a location where an operative had been found dead. The markers formed a pattern that radiated outward from the colonial settlements, showing how the humans had pushed their enemies further and further into hostile territory. "The Shadow Covenant leadership finally understood what they were facing," Vex said. "They sent a message to the colonists, offering to withdraw all operatives and pay compensation for the deaths that had occurred. They thought the humans would be reasonable, that they would accept peace when it was offered. And did they?" "No," Vex replied, and there was something cold in his voice. "The humans refused. They said that anyone who came to their world with the intention of killing their people had forfeited any right to mercy. And then they did something that no one had ever attempted before. The display changed one final time, showing the image of a woman with short dark hair and sharp eyes. Her name was listed as Katie Vance, and her occupation was simply marked as Colonial Militia. Katie Vance was a schoolteacher before the attacks began, Vex explained. After her husband was killed by one of the first assassins, she volunteered for the militia and quickly proved herself to be an exceptional leader. When the Colonial Council decided that defense was not enough, she was chosen to lead a strike team against the Shadow Covenant directly. Against their headquarters? Maison asked, his voice barely above a whisper, using information extracted from captured operatives. She led a team of 12 volunteers to the hidden station where the guild's leadership operated. They infiltrated the station, killed every member of the ruling council, destroyed their records and their resources, and escaped before anyone could respond. Vex paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. The Shadow Covenant ceased to exist, he concluded. 3,000 operatives, 100 years of history, all of it erased by a species that had only been traveling among the stars for a century and a half. And that is why no one will accept your contract, because we all remember what happened to those who thought humans were easy prey. Maison sat in silence for a long moment, his 3 eyes fixed on the holographic display that still showed the image of Katie Vance. The Merchant Lord was clearly struggling to process what he had heard, but Vex could see that he was not yet convinced, not completely. One battle, Maison finally said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier certainty. One colony of particularly determined settlers managed to defeat an assassination guild that had grown complacent. This does not prove that all humans are dangerous, only that the Shadow Covenant underestimated their target. Vex had expected this response. Beings like Maison did not easily abandon their assumptions, especially when those assumptions had allowed them to feel superior to others for so long. The Shadow Covenant was not an isolated incident, Vex replied, gesturing for the holographic display to change. What happened on New Montana was simply the most dramatic example of a pattern that has repeated itself across the galaxy for the past 2 centuries. Humans do not simply defend themselves when attacked. They pursue, they remember, and they never stop until they believe justice has been served. Justice. Maison repeated the word with a hint of scorn. A convenient excuse for vengeance. Call it what you wish, Vex said. The results are the same. Let me tell you about Chris Nguyen. The display shifted to show a middle-aged human male with weathered features and tired eyes. He was standing on the deck of a cargo vessel, wearing simple work clothes that marked him as someone who earned his living through honest labor. Chris Nguyen was a cargo ship captain who operated in the Valari sector about 40 years ago, Vex began. He had a small crew, a wife, and 2 children who traveled with him on his vessel. They were not wealthy, but they had built a good life together, moving supplies between colonies and outposts along the frontier. I am familiar with the Valari sector, Maison said. It was controlled by the Valari Syndicate until their collapse. Their collapse was not an accident, Vex replied. The Syndicate made the mistake of targeting Chris Nguyen's ship during a routine raid. His vessel was carrying medical supplies to a colony that had been struck by an outbreak, and the pirates decided that the cargo was valuable enough to justify killing everyone aboard. The display showed images of a damaged cargo ship, its hull scarred by weapons fire, and its interior destroyed by the violence that had taken place within. Vex watched Maison's face carefully, looking for any sign that the Merchant Lord was beginning to understand. Chris was not on the ship when the attack happened, Vex continued. He had stayed behind on a station to negotiate a contract for future deliveries. When he received word of what had happened, he rushed to the coordinates where his ship had been found. But there was nothing left except wreckage and bodies. His wife, his children, his entire crew. All of them murdered for a cargo hold full of medicine. A tragedy, Maison said, though his voice carried little genuine sympathy. But such things happen on the frontier. The galaxy is a dangerous place. They do happen, Vex agreed. But what happened next is what makes humans different from every other species. Most beings would grieve, would accept their loss, and would eventually move on with their lives. Chris Nguyen did not move on. He swore that he would destroy the Valari Syndicate, and then he spent the next 12 years making that oath a reality. The display began showing a timeline, marking events across more than a decade. Each entry detailed some action that Chris Nguyen had taken against the Syndicate, starting small and growing larger with each passing year. He began by learning everything he could about his enemy, Vex explained. He studied their language, their customs, their organizational structure. He took jobs that brought him into contact with their operations, never revealing his true intentions, always watching and waiting. One man against an entire criminal empire? Maison shook his head. He must have had help, backing from some government or rival organization. He had nothing but his own determination, Vex replied. Over those 12 years, he identified key members of the Syndicate and found ways to remove them. Sometimes he exposed their crimes to local authorities. Sometimes he manipulated rival factions into conflict with them, and sometimes he simply waited until they were vulnerable and struck directly. The timeline continued to scroll, showing the gradual deterioration of the Valari Syndicate. Operations failed, leaders disappeared, and paranoia spread through the organization like a disease. By the 10th year, the Syndicate leadership knew that someone was targeting them, Vex said. They hired investigators to find the source of their problems, and eventually they discovered that a single human had been responsible for the destruction of nearly a third of their operation. They were terrified, and they decided to negotiate. Negotiate? Maison repeated. With one man? They offered him everything, Vex confirmed. Wealth, territory, an apology for the deaths of his family, even the heads of the pirates who had actually carried out the attack. They believed that any reasonable being would accept such an offer and end his vendetta. And he refused. He refused, Vex nodded. He told them that they had taken everything from him, and he intended to take everything from them in return. He was not interested in compensation or apologies, only in complete and total destruction. The display showed the final years of the Syndicate's existence, a rapid collapse that left nothing behind. Operations crumbled, members fled to distant sectors, and those who remained were systematically eliminated. The Valari Syndicate had existed for over 200 years before Chris Nguyen decided to destroy them, Vex said. They controlled trade routes, commanded armies of criminals, and had corrupted officials across a dozen systems. All of it meant nothing against a single human who refused to stop. Maison was quiet now, his earlier arrogance fading as the weight of these stories began to settle on him. This is what humans call persistence, Vex continued. It is not just a trait, it is fundamental to their nature. Their bodies are designed for endurance, capable of traveling vast distances without rest. Their minds are capable of holding on to goals for years, even decades, without losing focus. When they decide that something must be done, they do not stop until it is finished. Surely there are limits, Maison said, but his voice was uncertain. Surely they can be deterred, or discouraged. That is what the Shadow Covenant believed, Vex replied. That is what the Valari Syndicate believed, and that is what every enemy of humanity has believed right up until the moment they realize their mistake. Humans are not deterred by difficulty or danger. They are motivated by it. The harder you make their path, the more determined they become to walk it. Vex leaned forward, his gray scales reflecting the light from the holographic display. Chris Nguyen died 15 years ago, he said. He passed peacefully in his sleep, an old man who had finally found some measure of peace. But his story is still told in every criminal organization in the galaxy, a warning to anyone who might consider harming a human. Because if you take from them, They will take from you, and they will not stop until the scales are balanced. Maison stared at the display, his 3 eyes unfocused as he processed what he had learned. The merchant lord was beginning to understand. Vex could see it, but there was still more that needed to be said. More examples that would make the danger absolutely clear. Maison rose from his seat and began to pace the archive room, his expensive robes dragging across the metal floor as he moved. The merchant lord was clearly troubled by what he had heard, but Vex could see that he was still searching for some weakness, some angle that would allow him to proceed with his plans. These stories are impressive, Maison admitted, stopping near one of the data storage units. But they describe individual humans, exceptional cases who possessed unusual determination. Jake Sullivan is not a retired Marine or a vengeful cargo captain. He is a bureaucrat who spends his days negotiating trade agreements and filing reports. You are missing the point, Vex replied. The danger does not come from Jake Sullivan himself. It comes from what happens when you harm him. Explain. Vex gestured for the holographic display to change once again. I have shown you what individual humans are capable of when they are motivated by vengeance. Now, let me show you what happens when humanity as a whole decides that someone has crossed a line. The display showed an image of the space station orbiting a blue and green world. The station was clearly designed for education, with multiple docking ports for visiting vessels and large observation windows that would give students a view of the planet below. This is the Meridian Academy, Vex said. 25 years ago, it was one of the most respected educational institutions on the frontier, a neutral facility where children from dozens of species could learn together. Humans, Corvani, Zethrani, Valari, all of them sent their young to study at Meridian. I have heard of it, Maison said. It was destroyed in some conflict, was it not? The station still exists, Vex corrected, but its reputation was changed forever by what happened there. A Korthan warlord named Greth Terran decided that he wanted to expand his territory, and he believed that taking hostages from Meridian would give him leverage to negotiate with the various governments whose children studied there. The display shifted to show the warlord, a massive reptilian creature covered in battle scars and wearing armor that had clearly seen many conflicts. His eyes were cold and calculating, the eyes of someone who viewed other beings as nothing more than tools to be used. Terran sent a strike team to the station and captured several students and teachers, Vex continued. Among them was a human woman named Lisa Tran, a language instructor who had been teaching at Meridian for 8 years. Terran believed that having a human hostage would be particularly valuable, since humanity had been expanding rapidly and had significant resources to offer. A reasonable calculation, Maison observed. Hostages are a traditional method of gaining leverage in negotiations. Traditional methods do not apply to humans, Vex replied. Terran sent his demands to the various governments, expecting weeks of negotiation and eventual concessions. Instead, within 72 hours, 3 human naval vessels arrived at his fortress moon. The display showed the warships, sleek and deadly vessels that bristled with weapons and carried the markings of the human military. They were not the largest ships in the galaxy, but there was something about their design that suggested efficiency and purpose. 3 ships against a fortress moon? Maison frowned. That seems like an inadequate response. It was not a military response, Vex explained. It was a message. The humans did not come to negotiate or to demonstrate force. They came to deliver an ultimatum. Their commander broadcast a single statement to Terran. Return the hostages unharmed within 1 hour, or face complete annihilation. Bluffing, Maison said. Surely they would not risk the lives of their own people. Terran believed the same thing, Vex replied. He had spent his entire life dealing with species who valued individual lives, who would make concessions rather than risk losing their people. He assumed humans would be the same, so he decided to test their resolve. The display showed a recording, grainy footage that had been captured by surveillance systems on the fortress. Lisa Tran was visible, bound and kneeling on a platform, while Terran stood behind her with a weapon drawn. "He executed her on a live broadcast," Vex said quietly. "He believed it would demonstrate his willingness to follow through on his threats, and would force the humans to negotiate. He expected them to become emotional, to plead for the other hostages, to offer whatever he demanded in exchange for preventing more deaths." Maison said nothing, his 3 eyes fixed on the display. "The human commander responded within minutes," Vex continued. "She did not plead or negotiate. She simply acknowledged that Lisa Tran was dead, stated that Terran had sealed his fate, and then ordered her ships to begin orbital bombardment. The display showed the fortress from space, and then there was light, terrible and blinding, as weapons designed to crack planetary defenses were unleashed against the structure. When the light faded, there was nothing left but molten rock and debris. The other hostages? Maison asked. Terran had moved them to a separate facility before the execution, Vex replied. The humans had already located that facility. Special forces teams extracted the remaining hostages while the bombardment was still ongoing. Not a single additional human life was lost. The display changed to show a map of the sector, with dozens of markers appearing across multiple star systems. But the humans did not stop there, Vex said. They declared that Terran's actions had proven his entire clan was a threat to civilized species. Over the following 3 years, they hunted down every member of his bloodline, every ally who had supported him, every soldier who had served under his command. Genocide, Maison whispered. They called it justice, Vex replied. They called it sending a message that would be remembered for generations. Harm one human and you do not face one enemy. You face their entire civilization. Every ship, every soldier, every resource they possess becomes dedicated to your destruction. Maison finally sat down again, his body seeming to deflate as the full weight of understanding settled on him. This is what we call the pack response, Vex explained. Humans are social creatures who form bonds with each other that transcend family or tribe. When one of them is harmed, the others do not simply feel sympathy. They feel as though they themselves have been attacked, and they respond accordingly. But surely they cannot respond this way to every threat, Maison protested weakly. They would exhaust themselves fighting constant wars. They do not need to respond to every threat, Vex replied. They only needed to respond once with such overwhelming force that no one would ever consider testing them again. The Meridian incident is taught in military academies across the galaxy, not as a battle study, but as a warning. Do not harm humans, because the consequences are not proportional. The display showed more footage, recordings of other species speaking about what they had witnessed. Diplomats and soldiers and scholars, all of them describing the same thing, a species that would sacrifice anything, do anything, to protect their own. Jake Sullivan is one human, Vex said, but if you kill him, you will not be facing one human. You will be facing a civilization that has proven it will burn worlds to avenge the death of a schoolteacher. Your mining operations, your wealth, your family, everything you have built will become nothing more than fuel for their fury. Maison was pale now, his purple skin taking on a grayish hue as fear finally began to overcome his arrogance. He understood at last what Vex had been trying to tell him, what every assassin in the galaxy already knew. Humans were not prey, they were the most dangerous predators the galaxy had ever seen, and their protection of each other was absolute. The archive room had grown cold, or perhaps it only felt that way because of the weight of the stories that had been shared within its walls. Maison sat in silence, his 3 eyes staring at nothing in particular, while Vex waited patiently for the merchant lord to gather his thoughts. There must be a way, Maison finally said, though his voice carried none of its earlier conviction. Some method of eliminating Jake Sullivan without triggering this response you describe. If the attack appears to be an accident, if there is no evidence pointing to any particular party, surely the humans cannot seek vengeance against a phantom. Vex had expected this question. It was the same question that every desperate being asked when they learned the truth about humanity. The final hope that perhaps cleverness could succeed where force had failed. "Let me tell you one more story," Vex replied. "It is shorter than the others, but perhaps it will be the most important." The holographic display changed to show a Drenari merchant, a thin creature with multiple limbs and compound eyes that reflected the light in strange patterns. His name was listed as Vreth Colin, and the records showed that he had been a successful trader in luxury goods throughout the eastern sectors. Vreth Colin had a dispute with a human businessman named Peter Walsh over a contract involving rare minerals, Vex began. "The details are not important. What matters is that Colin believed Walsh had cheated him, and he decided that the human needed to die." "Another vendetta," Maison observed. "But Colin was clever," Vex continued. "He did not hire assassins or send mercenaries. Instead, he spent 2 years developing a poison that was completely undetectable by human medical technology. He introduced it into Walsh's food during a trade conference, and the human died 3 weeks later from what appeared to be natural organ failure." The display showed medical records and investigation reports, all of them concluding that Peter Walsh had died from a rare but natural condition. There was no evidence of foul play, no witnesses, no connection to Vreth Colin in any way. "The perfect crime," Vex said. Colin returned to his business, confident that he had achieved his revenge without consequences. The humans mourned their loss and moved on with their lives, or so it appeared. But they did not move on, Maison guessed. "Humans have developed something they call the Persistent Investigation Network," Vex explained. "Every death of a human citizen, no matter how natural it appears, is recorded and analyzed. Patterns are tracked across years and decades, waiting for connections that might not be obvious at first glance." The display showed a complex web of data, lines connecting seemingly unrelated events across vast distances of space and time. 3 years after Peter Walsh died, a human investigator named Maria Reyes noticed something unusual, Vex said. Walsh had been in perfect health before attending the trade conference. His symptoms began shortly afterward, and they matched a pattern that had appeared in 2 other deaths over the previous 50 years, deaths that had also occurred after contact with Drenari merchants. "Coincidence?" Maison offered weakly. "The humans did not believe in coincidence," Vex replied. Reyes obtained samples of Walsh's preserved tissue and subjected them to new analysis techniques that had been developed since his death. She found traces of the poison, molecules so rare that they could only have come from a specific region of Drenari space. The display showed the investigation unfolding, a patient and methodical process that slowly narrowed the list of suspects until only one name remained. Vreth Colin believed he had committed the perfect crime, Vex said. But the humans did not give up. They did not accept the official conclusion. They kept investigating, kept developing new methods, kept searching for the truth. And eventually, they found it. "What happened to him?" Maison asked. "The humans did not arrest him," Vex replied. "They did not demand extradition or seek justice through legal channels. Instead, they simply released their findings. Every piece of evidence, every detail of their investigation, all of it made public for the entire galaxy to see." The display showed news reports and commercial records, tracking the rapid destruction of everything Colin had built. His reputation collapsed overnight. His trading partners abandoned him, and financial institutions froze his assets. Within a month, no one in the galaxy would do business with him, Vex continued. Ships refused to carry his cargo, stations refused to let him dock, and even his own family distanced themselves out of fear that association with him would bring the same fate upon them. "Social destruction," Maison whispered. He died alone on a station that refused to give him food or shelter, Vex confirmed. His body was found in a maintenance corridor, surrounded by empty containers he had scavenged from waste disposal. The perfect crime had earned him nothing but a slow and miserable end. The display went dark, and Vex turned to face Maison directly. "This is why the Crimson Ledger will not accept your contract," he said. "Not because we fear the immediate consequences, though those are terrible enough. We refuse because humans do not forget. Even if we succeeded in killing Jake Sullivan and made it look like an accident, even if we covered our tracks perfectly, we would spend the rest of our existence looking over our shoulders, waiting for the day when some human investigator finally connected the pieces." Maison was quiet for a long moment, his earlier anger and arrogance completely gone. In their place was something that might have been respect, or perhaps simply the realization that he had been foolish to pursue this course in the first place. "No guild will accept this contract?" he asked finally. "If you want Jake Sullivan dead, you will have to do it yourself, and if you do, you will face the consequences alone, because no one in the galaxy will be willing to help you once the humans begin their investigation." The Merchant Lord rose from his seat slowly, his movements heavy with the weight of his newfound understanding. He looked at Vex with an expression that was difficult to read, and then he nodded once. "I will cancel my operations near human territory," Maison said quietly. "Perhaps there are opportunities elsewhere that do not carry such risks." "A wise decision," Vex replied. Maison left the archive room without another word, his footsteps echoing through the corridor until they faded into silence. Vex remained where he was for a moment, looking at the darkened display and thinking about the stories he had told. The door opened again, and a young Corthan entered, his scales still bearing the bright colors of youth. This was Trell, a junior coordinator who had been with the guild for only a few cycles. "Did he accept the refusal?" Trell asked. "He did," Vex replied, moving to exit the archive. "He finally understood why we do not take contracts on humans." Trell fell into step beside his superior, his expression thoughtful. "I have heard the stories, but I have never understood why humans are so different from every other species. They are not the strongest or the fastest or the most technologically advanced. What makes them so dangerous?" Vex considered the question as they walked through the corridors of Nexus Station. It was a question he had asked himself many times over the years, and he had never found a completely satisfying answer. "Most species fight to survive," he finally said. "When the threat is gone, they stop fighting and return to their normal lives. Humans are different. They do not fight to survive. They fight to win. And they have proven across 100 conflicts that they do not know how to stop fighting until victory is absolute." Trell absorbed this in silence, and then asked another question. "Do you think they will ever become less dangerous as they integrate further into galactic society?" Vex reached his office and paused at the door, looking back at the young coordinator. It was a good question, one that scholars and military strategists had debated for decades. "I hope I never live long enough to find out," he replied. "Because if humans ever become truly comfortable in this galaxy, if they ever stop seeing themselves as newcomers who need to prove their strength, then the rest of us might finally learn just how much they have been holding back." He entered his office and poured himself a drink, a rare indulgence that he allowed himself, only when a particularly difficult conversation had ended. Outside the window, the lights of Nexus Station flickered in their eternal rhythm, and somewhere among those lights, a merchant lord was making arrangements to leave human space forever. The assassins of the Crimson Ledger would continue their work, taking contracts and ending lives across the galaxy. But they would never forget the rule that kept them alive, the truth that every killer in the universe knew by heart. Humans were off limits, not because of law or morality, but because attacking them was a death sentence. And even the Hitmen said no.